Good evening, everyone. On behalf of WNL's Lifelong Learning team, I'm delighted to welcome you to the first of 6 talks in our Faculty Frontiers webinar series. I'm Ruth Candler, the Associate Director of Lifelong Learning, and tonight we're joined by JT Torres, Director of WNL's Harte Center for Teaching and Learning. Why is understanding the science of lifelong learning so important? By understanding the science behind it, we can tap into our brain's natural plasticity to optimize learning throughout our lives. This empowers us to foster personal and professional growth, adapt to a rapidly changing world, enhance cognitive function, and ultimately lead to more fulfilling lives by unlocking our full potential at every stage. In essence, it offers us a roadmap for effective learning, not just during your time on campus, but throughout your entire life. I hope you've had a chance to review JT's bio, which we sent earlier along with the webinar link. If you did, you're going to see exactly why we are thrilled to have JT lead this webinar series with tonight's talk. Before we dive in, though, just a quick housekeeping note. Thank you for those who submitted questions in advance. If you have questions during JT's talk, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit them. We'll be collecting them throughout the JT's talk, and then during the Q&A portion at the end of the session, we will bring them up and address them. So let's go ahead and begin. JT, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk about a passion topic of mine. I talk about this all the time, and I think my wife is just tired of hearing about lifelong learning and curiosity. So she's always like, you should just go sit in a room and say that. And here I am in a studio, sitting in a room and saying the things that I like to say. So just grateful to be here. Thank you. You might notice my title, The Science of Lifelong Learning, or How Curiosity Actually Saved the Cat. And hopefully you have at least one question, which is, what does curiosity and lifelong learning have to do with each other? The second question should be, who am I to talk about this topic? So maybe we'll start there. I'm always curious about people who do presentations and then they include a picture of themselves, which I feel is redundant because you can already see me. So I wanted to include a picture of myself that's dramatically different. Here I am around 12 to 13 years old, and this is seriously when I became an educational researcher. I also wanted to include this picture because it's when I had hair and I no longer have that. So, just a little romantic period of me to just say like, oh yeah, I used to have this thing on my head. But otherwise, this is when I became an educational researcher. And not just at this age, but in this particular moment. You might recognize something of a church setting. When I was growing up in Miami, Florida, I went to Sunday school every week up until this age, and up until around this time. And Sunday school was a really interesting experience for me. It really did open my eyes up to the question on how do we learn, what is education, and what makes education meaningful. If you have not experienced Sunday school, it consists of adult volunteers reading passages of the Bible to a group of kids who have been fed a lot of sugary snacks. So really weird combination of what seemed to be an incredibly boring activity with rocket fuel. Besides that combination, I was actually very intrigued. I loved Sunday school. My undergraduate degree is in creative writing before I officially became an educational researcher with my PhD in educational psychology. So I've always loved stories, and I loved the stories in the Bible. So when these experiences were being shared and stories were being read to me, I actually just needed to know a lot more about these stories. And so I asked a lot of questions. I interrupted these poor volunteering adults with the questions that I asked. And my questions weren't just simple clarifications. I needed to know the logic and the science behind a lot of these stories. So I would interrupt teachers and I would say, how is it possible that Abraham lived to be 175? What was the diet back then? What was the lifestyle? Why don't we live that long now? I also asked questions like, how did Jonah actually survive in a whale? How did he not get digested by stomach acids and enzymes? How did he make it in one piece? And I learned quickly that Sunday school was not the place for questions. I remember I wrote down some quotes here that I wanted to share with you. I remember some of the things my teacher, my Sunday school volunteering teacher, I will just emphasize that these are volunteers because I feel very bad for them now reflecting on my time. And some of the quotes that I heard my teacher say about me to other adults. One, he can never just accept what I say. It's like he doesn't have faith. Two, I try to ignore him when he raises his hand, but then he stands up out of his seat and hops up and down like a fool. And then my favorite quote that I remember, I attend mass before every class so I can pray for patience. And I just want to clarify, I know that these things were actually said about me by my teacher because my teacher was my mother. At one point, my mom just completely gave up and reassigned me. So the way our Sunday school worked is, all the kids were in the room, the adults came in, and then we all got divvied up to sit with certain adults, to go over the sessions and to go over the lesson. And so my mom gave up on me and assigned me to the priests group. When you get sent by your mom to a priest, that's a whole nother level of trouble that you are in, by the way. So anyway, I'm in the priest group. I'm asking all the questions that I'm asking. And again, questions coming from a place of sincere interest. And I remember the priest said to me, your questions are like asking how many grains of sand there are on a beach. Even if there is an answer, it would take longer than your life to answer it. To this day, I'm not sure if he was trying to caution me or inspire me, but he inspired me. It was really at that point where I just became interested in storytelling and learning, and this burning feeling that I had that I did not fully grasp the story, and I needed to. So fast forward many years into graduate school, studying educational psychology, studying how we learn, studying education, and what I realized is this theme of question asking is at the heart of how we learn. Some of the research that I encountered as a young graduate student, coming from the 2021 issue of Educational Psychology Review, for instance, the quote, "We believe that promoting interest in the classroom increases students' intrinsic motivation to learn and the number of learning strategies they use to do so." I came across studies in journals like the Progress in Brain Research that stated curiosity-driven learning and intrinsic motivation have been argued to be fundamental ingredients for efficient education. And then another example, Michael Turner, the famous astrophysicist who I believe coined the term dark energy in a 2014 edition of Science, said, "Curiosity gets scientists out of bed every morning. It is one of humankind's greatest assets." And then just fun fact, notice how the Science edition is also trying to pull on your curiosity to buy the actual magazine. What's killing those sea stars? We must know. And so thinking about my early experience and thinking about what I was encountering in graduate school and what I study and research now around the relationship between learning, curiosity, and interest, I wanted to spend the time today in this webinar to cover three interesting questions, or questions that I find interesting. One, what is lifelong learning? How is that different from learning? Two, what does it have to do with curiosity? And three, are any cats harmed? Legitimate questions. So let's just get one and two out of the way and say lifelong learning literally is just staying curious throughout your life. You're constantly asking questions. You're constantly wanting to know more about the world, about yourself, about others. And the brain as an organ, and the mind as a philosophical concept, as something that drives us through our social environments, relies on curiosity as a motivational force. There's a pleasurable sensation that we feel when we're watching a movie and we can kind of predict where the plot is going, or we're working on a puzzle and we finally start to see it coming together, or we hear a riddle or a joke and we have this aha moment, or even just basic problem solving. We actually feel pleasure. Our brains actually reward us for those experiences. And when that happens, we actually develop the desire to feel that pleasure again. So, and not only is our brain feeling this sense of pleasure, but we're also utilizing curiosity as a method of lifelong learning to make sense of the world. If we think about the infinite number of stimuli that we encounter on a daily basis, the different sights and sounds and smells and the information and the people who might stop to talk to us, or the phone calls that we're receiving and the notifications on our phone, we are constantly inundated with stimuli. And if our brains tried to absorb all of that information at once, it would be the equivalent of having a seizure 24/7, right? Just complete activation of all of our regions. So our brains use curiosity as something of a critical filter, not just to motivate us to close gaps between what we know and what we don't know, but also to keep us from being overwhelmed. Curiosity directs our attention and gives us the impetus for what we want to learn about on a continuous basis. So, and as we compress the information that is filtered by curiosity, we develop mental representations of the world. And our brains reward us each time we encounter new knowledge that validates that mental representation. So there's a reward aspect there. There's also a reward aspect in our brain when we encounter new knowledge that is at odds with our mental representation. So I was born in Miami, Florida. I did not see snow for the first time until I was about 15. And so you can imagine this mental representation that I have where winter should be 60 degrees. And now I see this substance that I've only heard about and I have no idea what it is. And that contrast between what I thought I know about the world as a 15-year-old and this brand new experience was also just like setting my brain on fire with interest and curiosity. Like, what is this? I'm not going to break out into the Jack Skellington song. What's this? What's this? From Nightmare Before Christmas. But it is like that scenario where it's a win-win situation for the pleasure and the brain health that we receive that we experience whenever we have a curiosity that is either satisfied or not satisfied. There's a motivation to keep going. There's a famous neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio, and he calls this process homeostatic regulation. We're constantly seeking sense in the world. We're constantly seeking meaning, and that meaning might be in contrast with an experience, or it might be validated by an experience. And each time we have those experiences, our brains are adjusting our mental representations to help us keep coherence. And so we have this circulatory process where we're making sense of things, but we're also feeling rewarded, and we're feeling pleasure in this process as well. We also use this process to develop self-awareness. So part of this process of staying curious and lifelong learning, in part, defines consciousness as well. So I'll just provide a very, very simple illustration for us to move forward into our next part. Imagine a hungry human who experiences the pleasure of a particularly satisfying fruit, let's say an apple. And once they experience that apple and how sugary and sweet it might taste when they bite into it and the crispness of that apple, they might develop curiosity over that fruit, for that fruit over any other kind of fruit, especially if there's a fruit that doesn't have that same level of sweetness. And so that desire for this fruit, that curiosity for that fruit, might lead to asking more questions about it or just wanting to know about it for its own sake, and maybe even obsessing over that fruit to the point of sin. And like maybe we see a metaphorical representation here, such as in Rubens' famous painting, 16th century painting of the Garden of Eden, where we see the curiosity and the desire for a particular fruit might even be sinful and the downfall of humans. I just wanted to include this connection to prove that I really was paying attention in Sunday school. Just wanted everyone to know. Cool. So that's a really nice preamble, I think, of how I will use curiosity as a concept to define what lifelong learning is and the benefits that it has for us as human beings throughout any age of our life cycle. But I wanted to give a chance for all of us to experience curiosity, because one of the points that I will make is that we can catalyze curiosity. We can be in control of how curious we are as human beings in any given context, in or out of a classroom. And so let's get curious now for a couple of minutes. We're going to do something called the paperclip challenge. It is pretty well known and famous. If you know it, just pretend you don't, and let's go along for the ride. If you don't know it, please don't Google it. Curiosity works best when there's some element of mystery or uncertainty. In general, how this works is participants are invited into a room and they're given 10 minutes, 20 minutes. The studies have worked in different ways. And people are asked a simple question: how many uses for a paperclip can you imagine? That's it. How many uses for a paperclip can you imagine? Let me provide you all, let's say, 4 minutes. And I'd like to provide you that time and really encourage you, take the time to think and try to stretch your creativity and your curiosity around what can a paperclip actually be used for. I think asking the question begets some interesting answers versus assuming that a paperclip just holds paper together. That's one. So take a couple of minutes, list it out. And I might invite some of you during the Q&A if you have some really interesting answers that you're proud of. Maybe you want to share those with us and the group. But take some time, list out how many uses for a paperclip can you imagine? I hope you all remember our friend Clippy from early iterations of Microsoft Word. Always so helpful. So maybe you didn't have a full 4 minutes, but we can come back to it in the Q&A if you all want more time to think of paperclip uses. This study was made famous by Sir Ken Robinson, who has an excellent TED Talk around divergent thinking and the relationship that schools play in fostering or inhibiting divergent thinking. I don't want to throw too many concepts. I'd like to stay within the realm of lifelong learning and curiosity, but just a quick recap from Ken Robinson. Divergent thinking is a mode of thinking that makes creativity possible, that makes problem solving possible. And at the heart of divergent thinking is curiosity. Ken Robinson defined divergent thinking in contrast from convergent thinking as not accepting answers as answers prima facie, but asking new questions about answers or allowing answers to turn into new questions. So according to Ken Robinson, if we approach something like a paperclip and we ask more questions about what it can do versus accepting what we're used to it doing, we're mobilizing curiosity to help us become better problem solvers and thinkers in general. The other thing Ken Robinson does is in his TED Talk is he really does a good job of illustrating and summarizing the study that went into this paperclip challenge, and I wanted to share that with you. According to the researchers, if you can come up with 200 uses of a paperclip, you are certified a curious, divergent thinker. 200. So keep in mind, I did not even give you the full 4 minutes that I promised you. So if you reached 10, I mean, that's amazing. That's pretty impressive. If you reached more than 10, let me know in the Q&A as well. I would love to hear your answers. But 200 is seen as the gold standard, and that's the threshold of where we can see some curious thinkers or curiosity lead to divergent thinking, creative thinking, problem solving, and so on. This metric and this threshold came from a longitudinal study of over 1,500 students that lasted about 15 years. The first measurement was from kindergarten students. So what the researchers did is that, again, they arrived at this idea that 200 is the threshold, and they did it through this study. So when they first measured kindergartners and they brought them into a room and they gave them about 20 minutes to come up with as many different purposes as they can for a paperclip, you can take a second and guess how many kindergartners do you think actually came up with at least 200? The answer is 98%. 98% of kindergartners could come up with at least 200 uses for a paperclip. They tracked the same students 5 to 6 years later. Brought them into the room, same exact prompt, and asked them how many uses for a paperclip they can think of. If you want to take a second to guess what you think that number is, 50%. They tracked the same students 5 to 6 years later, asked them to come into a room, and they gave them the same prompt. I think you can see the trend. 42%. So this is very interesting to me as an educator. I have so many questions around what happened. It looks like, it seems to be from this study and from from other studies that have replicated these results, that our capacity for curiosity deteriorates with age. It seems from these results that lifelong learning is not possible. But there is no biological reason for that to be. There's no mechanism in our brain that seems to shut down curiosity and question asking and creativity from kindergarten to 15 years old. So what could be happening? My argument and what I think is happening, and I'll include some science to back this up, is lifelong learning is not the norm in our society. We have some pretty clear endpoints for education that are somewhat problematic. The first endpoint is the high school graduation, right? After that, education is no longer compulsory. We send the messages that you've learned enough. Go out there and participate in society, right? College becomes optional. Graduate degrees become even more optional. The amount of family members who raised their eyes in disappointment when I said I wanted to go on to a master's and then a PhD, and the amount of family members who said, don't you have enough degrees? When are you going to get a real job, right? Like it's astounding. And I think it's part of this social norm that we don't actually advocate or build social structures for lifelong learning or increased curiosity. Some quick examples to showcase this point. Saint Bernard Clairvaux, a 12th century monk, said, "To learn in order to know is scandalous curiosity." Keep in mind, this is the 12th century. Scandalous is not a synonym for cool here. Scandalous literally means it's a sin to learn it's a sin to learn for the sake of learning. Queen Victoria, in a letter to her granddaughter, Princess Victoria of Hesse, in the 19th century said, "I would earnestly warn you against trying to find out the reason for and explanation of everything. To try and find out the reason for everything is very dangerous and leads to nothing but disappointment and dissatisfaction, unsettling your mind and in the end making you miserable." Imagine this being a motto for a college or university, right? Like totally against the science, but Queen Victoria was a trendsetter. So here we are. Pablo Picasso famously said, "Every child is an artist. The problem is how to remain an artist once we grow up." And of course, for Picasso, he doesn't just literally mean a skilled artist. He means someone who has a visionary way of looking at the world and asking different kinds of questions about it. Sir Ken Robinson, who I quoted with the paperclip challenge, said, "We are educating people out of their creative capacities." And then Ben Jonson, who came up with the phrase that we all know so well in 1598 in a play. It was originally stated, "Care killed the cat." And then I think Shakespeare picked up the line, and I think over time, it eventually became "Curiosity killed the cat." And that is the cautionary tale that we carry with us today. And to go back to the schools and our school system that Sir Ken Robinson talked about, and most of my experience as an educator, I've worked in K through 12 settings in higher ed, so I'll often be drawing from educational context because it's what I know well. But we have structures in place in school as early as elementary school that shut down or make curiosity much more difficult. For instance, we have career days as early as elementary school. So we ask children to foreclose future possibilities at a very, very young age. We are a very test-heavy educational culture. We have SATs, we have state-specific tests, we have ACTs, we have GREs to get into graduate school. We have so many tests that we have inadvertently communicated that the most important thing in education is the one right answer, which might be in the back of the book or on ChatGPT. Just don't use both. But there's one right answer, and that's what we're looking for. And so once again, we don't give those opportunities for curiosity or planting the seeds for lifelong learning. Ironically though, to come back to this cat scenario, it might be avoiding curiosity that actually kills cats or killed the cat. Several studies, one particular study in 2018 finds that curiosity and aging are indeed correlational, right? As we age, we tend to display less curious or exploratory behavior, and we tend to disengage from lifelong learning. At the same time, right, according to this one particular study that I'm referencing by Sakaki et al. And his team, um, the less curious we become, the faster we age. And so I have a diagram, and this is by no means an actual MRI, as I'm sure you can tell. I just think it's a lovely illustration. It is created by NPR, and so I'm sharing it here, hopefully with their permission. And so what we see here is just, I want to display how curiosity works. And this illustration is a really good, does a really good job of expressing the Sakaki study that I'm drawing from for this portion of the webinar. And it's just to communicate the actual neurological pathways and benefits of curiosity. When we are engaged in curious behavior, and by that I mean when individuals are confronted with information that they find interesting and or information that they have not encountered before. So imagine, young me experiencing snow for the first time, or someone watching a movie and they don't know how it ends. We have the ventral tegmental area producing a good amount of dopamine, and as dopamine gets sent to the frontal cortex, we're maintaining neural connections. We're also creating new connections. It's like we're oxygenating our brain. We're creating some good flow, and our brain tends to act as as a neurological immune system when we are engaged in curious behavior. And so with the dopamine production, what the dopamine actually does is move through and help create currents of flow and activity in our brain that helps reduce inflammation, that helps stave off neural degeneration. But as we age, we do just naturally create less dopamine, right? And it's not so much, again, like there's no biological mechanism that says, hey, you're 30, stop with the dopamine, right? It's less about that, and it's more about the world doesn't have as much wonder for us anymore, right? So once I saw snow that first time, my brain lit up with the Jack Skellington song, What's This? Once I've seen snow the 30th time, yeah, it's snow. I know what that is now, right? So it's the stimulus, it's the environmental stimuli interacting with my brain and my mind that is having that effect. So we're able to anticipate the world a little bit more. We're able to predict the world a little bit more. And as we're able to predict the world and there's fewer surprises, there's less of a reason for rapid dopamine release. So I just wanted to be clear with the nuance that while studies do indicate that we do create less dopamine as we age, a lot of that are environmental cues and conditions, and not necessarily that our systems are being depleted, for instance. So what's interesting and why I'm like really emphasizing this social effect is the social is the variables that we can control, right? So when we no longer experience exploratory behavior and when we no longer foster interest in novelty, our systems do deteriorate at a much faster rate. And then once that cycle begins, it becomes very, very difficult to stop. The decline in curiosity accelerates aging by limiting engagement in cognitively stimulating activities, which we need for that health. Okay, and Carstensen offers a theoretical framework for us to talk about these social variables and these influences. It's called socio-emotional selectivity theory. And according to Carstensen's theory, as people age, we view time very differently. So you can imagine being young and foolhardy and thinking the world is open to your possibilities, right? Time doesn't really mean anything. And when we have this kind of mindset, we're much more open to information-seeking goals. When time is perceived as open-ended, we might be more motivated to expand our social network, our knowledge, our skill set. We're okay learning for the sake of learning because we don't really know what's coming in our future, and we think we have all the time in the world. And so curiosity seems to fit really well with that mindset. On the other hand, when time is perceived as finite, long-term expansive goals and experiences are less likely to be realized or seen as useful. So one is more likely to shift their focus to the present goals that provide immediate satisfaction. So socio-emotional selectivity theory really, really emphasizes this idea that as the world becomes more predictable for us, we seek security, we seek comfort, we seek stability. But at the same time, as I shared, thinking about that, what curiosity does for our brain, it becomes something as a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then once we stop or limit those exploratory behaviors, those novel situations, we're not really giving our brain a reason to make use of the dopaminergic pathways and systems that can help keep us healthy. So there's a quote that I think captures this really well. It's an apocryphal quote. Otherwise, I would have made a graphic for it. I have not been able to track down the source. If anyone does know the actual source, feel free to let me know in the Q&A. And the quote goes, "We do not stop being curious because we grow old. We grow old because we stop being curious." But I have good news as well. This is the first talk in a series, and I don't want it to be so apocalyptic. There's good news, and we'll spend the rest of the time talking about that. Let's start off with a good quote. Sakaki, the same study that I've been citing, says and finds, not just says, but like finds in their research that higher curiosity predicts a better 5-year survival rate in older adults, even after controlling for risk factors like lifestyle and education, right? So education is not a mediating variable to determine whether one is curious or not. And lifestyle is not as explanatory as a variable to a 5-year survival rate as much as curiosity, or they're about similar, which is hopeful and promising. Because again, variables that we can control, we can be curious. We can always look at a paperclip and find more uses for it. In the same study, patients with mild cognitive impairment who showed higher levels of apathy, right? Apathy defined as a lack of care or curiosity about a particular topic, were more likely to develop dementia later in life. Also, part of their studies, these findings are not specific to humans. Rats also maintained healthier cognitive function in old age when they displayed higher exploratory behavior, such as being willing to try new treats, pellets, or being willing to try new pathways on their mazes. In a study closer to my world of education, Gruber, Gelman, and Ranganath find that curiosity is literally the foundation of learning. So what they did in their study is as they used functional MRIs and they assessed the activation of brain regions associated with curiosity while answering particular trivia questions, and while also trying to recognize particular faces in memory tests, delayed memory tests, as well as in the moment trivia questions. And as you can see, we have statistical significance between individuals who were curious about a trivia question or curious about a particular face and those who were not, and they had better recall for both. So memory function was greatly improved just by being interested or curious about something, about the thing that you're supposed to be curious about. In another study by Kashtin and Steger, found the relationship between curiosity and wellness. And so just to simplify, they were looking at some covariates between curiosity and exploration inventory. And so we don't have to worry about this axis in particular. We can just compare, for the sake of this presentation, high daily curiosity with those who identified as low daily curiosity. And on these markers, people who define themselves as having high daily curiosity also exhibited daily growth-oriented behavior. So things like growth mindset, willing to try new things, willing to engage in behaviors that will challenge themselves, even if the task was difficult. We also saw these individuals that rated themselves as high daily curiosity score much higher on meaning of life surveys. So they interpreted life as being more meaningful, and then a huge difference in daily life satisfaction. Life was more enjoyable when they were curious about it. And these effects are not just individual. A lot of research, especially research that I'm currently involved in, looks at the social impact of curiosity. Curiosity and lifelong learning helps not just connect one another as people, but helps connect us as communities, helps with collaborative problem solving, helps bring ideas together in new ways. A study published last year had this quote that I really like, where they define curiosity as an interdependent system of knowledge composed of relations among informational units, which grows over time by relational finding actions. Everything is about finding those relationships. And given that we are currently in a highly politicized, highly polarized world, I know this is January when I'm giving this presentation, so I'm sure some of us had some holiday dinners where maybe debates emerged. And this is the world that we live in. And what's interesting is there have been studies that have looked at polarization and looked at people's tendencies to argue with those who disagree with them. And in a setting where people were only allowed to ask questions from one another, when people were positioned as learners in an opportunity to learn from one another, we saw fewer debates, we saw fewer levels of frustration in these studies, and fewer levels of disagreement even. Even when people acknowledged that they disagree with the person in front of them, they felt that they were more likely to have a civil conversation because they kept that curious mindset. This is a methodology that Braver Angels, for instance, have made very popular in their sessions and their practices. And let me skip through that painting and just say, I think there's something about curiosity and the collective, curiosity and community, the social impact of curiosity that really gives us reason for why we would want to attend a sporting event with a large group of people, why we want to go to theater and sit as part of an audience, why we appreciate musical events and experiences as part of an audience, or religious events and having someone else there. When I look at these images, the first thing I think is, man, parking's got to be a nightmare. I mean, we're in an era of Netflix, streaming TV. I can watch the NFL playoffs on my phone, sitting on my couch, and yet these kinds of events are still very popular. Why? Because shared curiosity connects people, brings people together, and that dopamine release that gives us that rewarding sensation experience as part of a collective really does unite people and really does create this powerful opportunity, not just for individual health, but social health as well. So what do we do? What do we do as individuals, assuming that everything that I just said is true? How do we save ourselves as proverbial cats? There's a few things here that I think will take us nicely into a Q&A. One is this idea of expertise, right? So this paperclip challenge has actually been replicated with professionals, engineers, people that are highly expert. They didn't reach the 200. So what does that mean about expertise? Scientists now are talking about, and especially educational researchers, are talking about this idea of relational expertise, which is really the accepting that expertise depends on the relationship that I'm in. I might be an expert in learning theory, but if I'm working with a biologist who's trying to design their course, my expertise now becomes relational, and that I need to trust and work with this person's expertise on how biology works so I can help them design a classroom, right? It's the acknowledgement that while I might be an expert in some contexts, there's a lot more that I have to know. It's more of a humbling concept of expertise to know that there's always more development for us depending on who we're in relationship with. Actively engaging difference. Again, we live in a society where we really want to live in a predictable world. We're obsessed with financial security. We're obsessed with predictable job markets. And just to be clear, we should be obsessed with those things. I'm not saying that we should be reckless with our money or, throw caution to the wind and let's just improvise our lives. But we just need to be aware that having the focus and the obsession with those things will come with some cost. So we need to actively engage difference, actively engage people who don't look like us, who don't think like us, have conversations with people who hold politics that are radically different from ours, and see if that can become a healthy daily activity. Seek novelty. Again, we want stability, we want comfort. Those are human desires. It's not that those desires are ever going to stop, but challenging ourselves to do new things, to try new foods, to go to new places, pick up new books or movies, and seeking novelty for its own sake. And then something that I love to tell my students, because I think that was the theme of this session, is questions are magic. Always ask questions, more so than conclusions. I teach a lot of writing classes, and once we get to that conclusion, that concluding paragraph, I tell my students to try to end on a question. Now that you've done all of this and you've proven how smart you are by doing this research and communicating to me, what new questions does this make you think of? And value that over the conclusions. Otherwise, I just want to say, last word, I'm actually a dog person. But otherwise, I had fun playing with the cats for this. And yeah, I think we're good to go into a Q&A.
Great. Thank you, JT. I appreciate it, and what a way to open up a Q&A session by suggesting to ask questions. So we had some great questions that were posed before the webinar, and then a lot that have come in during the webinar. Um, so one question is, do you think that American K through 12 educational system is basically designed to stomp out curiosity in students? And if you agree, what changes should be made?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you. And I'll back up into this question by saying, before I came to Washington and Lee, I was a field supervisor for public schools in Colorado. And so I've worked a lot with superintendents. I've worked a lot with teachers at all levels who are designing curriculum, who are actually there teaching, who are working with Common Core, developing assessments. And so I just want to say that there are a lot of good people in public education who want curiosity and want creative thinking. But I do think like there's a system in place, and I can't recommend Sir Ken Robinson's TED Talk anymore. But there's a system, right, where we funnel human beings through educational experiences based on age. Right, you go first grade, second grade, third grade, and you just got to learn it. And if you don't learn it, we're going to move you along anyways. You'll learn it, and you won't. And whether you learn it or not, we don't really know. And then our only mechanism for knowing whether learning is happening at all are these standardized tests. So I think there's a lot of just structures in place that make it about being right. And there's also some pretty high stakes. We know cognitively how important failure is. We know from a human development perspective how important it is to fail at something and to reflect on that failure and to grow from it. But man, if you fail fourth grade and you have to take that again, that changes your entire life trajectory. So there's so many unnecessarily high stakes in public education or just education in general that we've really removed any possibility of productive failure, productive struggle. And these things are part of being curious and lifelong learning. And so I think some of those changes are we need to empower teachers and classrooms to come up with creative spaces. There's a lot of risk taken involved. We can't perfectly script curiosity, and we can't perfectly script failure and the things that we know generate to really active learning and creative thinking. Right? Creativity is a pretty messy process. If I've worked with many artists and many creative teachers like fine arts teachers and so on, and research projects where I'm just trying to get a common definition. Like, could we actually standardize creativity and know how to assess it? And the answer so far is no, because everybody has their own definitions, and that's okay. That just proves how messy it is. But any attempt to standardize it means that we're going to be favoring right answers again and not giving the chance for people to explore and be wrong and experiment and reflect on those experiences.
So on the topic of education, what would you advise an English teacher who has a student who questions the traditional theory of who the real Shakespeare was?
Oh, that first of all, I want to meet that student. That's so far so good, right? The students are already asking questions. They're questioning things. I might support that path. I support the path that the students on and turn that into some research, right? Like people have to have this aha moment. And so there's this general theory behind learning that goes all the way back to Socrates, right? And Socrates had this quote where it says, "You trying to instill knowledge in someone is like trying to give," and there's some ableism in this quote. This is Socrates, though, is like trying to give a blind person vision, right? You can't just put it in someone's head. Learning is all about figuring things out, like, and having that aha moment yourself. And so one of the things when I train teachers at all levels, or when I help coach educators at all levels, the one thing that we just cannot do is give people the answer, because then that aha moment didn't happen. People have to arrive at their conclusions and then ask new questions about those conclusions. So it sounds like this is a great situation for that student who's asking questions, and then equip the student with the methods and processes they need so they can actually come to their arrival and they can come to their conclusions that hopefully makes sense for them with some feedback and guidance that might work. I've also been in similar situations where I've pushed my students for creativity and question asking and curiosity, and then they all want to talk to me about conspiracy theories. I was like, well, hold on. There are some things we know to be true. But we're constantly dancing between I want people in radical possibility, but I also want people sticking to facts. And so that's always going to be the dance of a teacher. But if you have students asking questions like that, that's a really good place.
Mm. Do you agree with standardized testing and end of grade testing? And is it a benefit for our educational system? And why are we losing ground compared to other countries?
Yeah. Ooh, these are such good questions. I've been trained in assessment. I've been trained by people who work for ETS and College Board, right? People who develop a lot of standardized tests, and they're exceptional scholars and exceptional people. And what they would share with me all the time is there's no such thing as an invalid test, but there are invalid uses of the test. And so there's a lot of nuance in that question where standardized tests certainly have their place and they can certainly be useful. But when we do things like tie it to teacher pay, which some states had done in the past, or we tie standardized tests to a student's probability that they will be successful in college. For example, we know that SATs don't predict college success. GPA is a much better predictor, right? SATs don't really provide that. During the pandemic, a lot of universities dropped standardized testing requirements. And guess what? Students were successful. A lot of students were successful, right? It didn't explain anything, success or failure. And so that's a use issue, though, because I think there's some real value in having a test that everybody takes. For one, there's an equity issue there, right? If we remove standardized tests immediately, there's the potential that there'll be good schools in the country and then bad schools in the country. And, as I said that, I realize that's probably already the case, but much worse, right? Where you need to go to a particular college or even a region of the United States if you want a quality education, and that shouldn't be the way, right? So there are some good uses for standardized tests. I think it's the current uses of it that have become invalid, where we're using them to try to measure or hold people accountable. That just does not make sense given that system. That being said, being trained in assessment, I do love assessment, and I don't know how to teach without assessment. So things like teacher designed tests are much more powerful. A lot of studies that show that teacher designed assessments of their own students are much more accurate depictions of the students' learning. A lot of these standardized tests are designed in a laboratory and delivered by someone else that's never actually met these students. So it might seem, while equity is a really important point, it might also seem senseless that students in Hawaii are taking the same exact test as students in Alaska. Very different cultures, very different regions. I mean, the human brain is only going to change so much, but culture and environment will change how that brain operates. And so there's a lot of nuance there and a lot of work that needs to be done around how we test and what do we do with those testing results.
Point. So, arguably the most narrowing and non-curious question from a student is, what do I need to do to get an A in this class? How do you help faculty move beyond that and convert the question into genuine curiosity? The achievement, ticket punching imperative of careerism seems so dominant in much of
Mm.
education.
Yep, yep, absolutely. And like I said, career days starting in elementary school. Oh man, yeah, no, we're asking people to foreclose their futures way too young, way too early. Yeah. One thing that I've done in my class, my classes, and one thing that I help coach faculty and teachers at all levels is we have to find ways to de-emphasize grades. There's a lot of scholars and a lot of research out there that really supports the point that grades get in the way of learning. There's a fabulous book that was just published by Joshua Eiler, it's called How Grades Fail Our Children, or How Grades Fail Our Future. And the science just shows that grades become such a powerful external motivator that it overshadows the intrinsic motivation. And so what I do is, there are movements out there that are ones called ungrading, right? And it doesn't necessarily you mean you totally ignore grades and you don't you pretend they don't exist at all, but they're incredibly de-emphasized. So in my classes, I don't have a point system or a percentage system, but I still have letter grades, and what I use are qualitative definitions of what those grades mean. And so I might ask, or I might stay on there that, curiosity is a goal of mine. You will ask some unanswerable questions and you will develop methods for answering those questions, right? And if I'm able to spell those out word for word as qualitative statements, then students can see the goalpost and they can see what's asked of them. And then they have some clear expectations. And then when it comes down to assessment time, I've never had grade grubbing, for example, in this environment. I've never had someone ask me, what's the difference between an 89 and a 90? Because, spoiler alert, I have no idea. But if they come up to me and they say, I'm supposed to develop methods for my question, and I have a B on that, what happened? And then already we're opening up a conversation for, well, let's look at your methods. Or if it's I need to reflect. I have a lot of reflection in my classes. I need to critically reflect on my processes in order to get an A, but right now I have a B. What happened with my reflection? Right? Like they're asking about the process now. They're asking about the immersive experience that they need to do, the task they need to do, the skills they need to develop. And I'd rather have that be the conversation than trying to play a point game system with them, or trying to play a point system game with them. So it's any way to direct their attention away from the grades and onto the learning, which requires a lot of feedback. It's also a culture change, but it slowly redirecting that attention into here are the skills, here's the knowledge, here are the things that that if you do, you will get the grade that you want.
Thank you. Let's talk about curiosity for a moment. Are there measures of how open someone is to change? And if so, is
Yeah.
there a positive correlation between that measure and how curious someone is?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So there's all sorts of scales out there. One is a relational construal scale, and it comes from the literature on relational expertise that I shared at the end. And what a lot of these studies find is that openness, that how one defines themselves. And so on a relational construal, it just means like how do people construe themselves? And for those that construe themselves as relational, they understand that who I am in a given moment depends on who I am in relationship to at that moment. So for example, right now I'm using my presenter voice and I'm trying to be an academic presenter. But if I go home tonight and I talk this way to my wife, she gets so upset. She's like, "Don't mansplain to me. You're talking to me like you're a student. Like become husband JT. Do something else. I don't like this." And so like who I am fundamentally changes based on the person that I'm with, based on the time of day, and people who are more open to this idea that my identity is fluid, that I change throughout the day, that the world changes around me, are not only more likely, there is a correlation with curiosity, but they're also the term is cognitively resilient. They're also more resilient to change. Change doesn't disrupt them so much. They have lower stress levels in the face of disruption, lower anxiety levels. So there's a lot of health benefits that we see that correlate with curiosity, but it has to, a lot of it does come down to this. I love how the question frames it as openness, right? How open are we versus how much do we try to cling to what we think is a stable identity from context to context?
So, so curiosity, is it ever too late? We have one question that asks, is college too late to try and reintroduce curiosity and risk taking?
Yeah, no, it's never too late. There's I know I focus a lot on curiosity killed the cat, but there's also a dog one about you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Also not true. Right, there are social forces at play. Absolutely. Is it more difficult? For sure. Why is it more difficult? Because we become comfortable. Not because anything's happening in terms of an internal biological clock, but because we become comfortable with the way things are. I've served as a consultant for a couple of different institutions, both in higher ed contexts as well as professional executive contexts and K through 12. And the amount of times I walk into, whenever I start one of these consultations or program reviews, I always start with interviews. I need to get a lay of the land and know what the culture is. And I can almost guarantee 100% of the time, whenever I walk into a new setting and I do interviews with people and focus groups, the first thing I'm going to hear is, well, this is how it's always been done. Right? Like it's just the resounding choral in any organization. This is how it's always been done. And then I will follow up with, says who? And no one can ever name, right? It's just like, this is what we do. This is the normalcy, the reign of normalcy, the psychology of imitation, right? Like there's a lot of science behind, we're very imitative social creatures. We're powerfully social creatures. So we're always going to want to fit in first and foremost. There's an evolutionary mechanism there, right? And just to cut ourselves some slack, right? Imagine the divergent thinking, curious human being in prehistoric times who's like, you know what? I'm going to go that way. That person's probably getting eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, right? So it's not really a good survival mechanism to be so radically open-minded. And so there is an evolutionary mechanism for us to conform and fit in. And so we should be kind to ourselves, but know that those are social forces. And so it's never too late to introduce curiosity. As I was preparing for this, is just like really good timing. There's an article in The Guardian, and I can see if I can share it if anyone is interested. And they profile 6 different people who picked up a new hobby or new skill late in life. So one is a 30-year-old who learned how to read for the first time. Another is a
Wow.
76-year-old who learned how to cook for the first time. Right? And it's a really heartwarming story. His spouse had passed away, and he shared early on, is like, I didn't know why I should learn to cook just for myself. But I started his daughter encouraged him to attend some cooking classes, and now as a culinary artist, as a hobbyist at 76 years old, right, learned a brand new skill set. Others who learned musical instruments, and so like seriously, just published 2 days ago, profiling people who remain curious at different stages of their lives. So no, it's never too late. A lot of it is just getting over some of that comfort that we feel by being in our routines, and nothing is healthier for us than disrupting that routine.
So, JT, how do we become more curious?
Yeah, yeah. So there, some of that is challenge. Well, challenges, but collective challenges, right? As I was sharing with this idea of collective all, have the idea of affinity groups are becoming very, very popular in all sorts of organizational settings, educational settings, professional settings, social settings, nursing homes, right? A lot of different places are using this idea of an affinity group. Affinity group just means you're connecting because of a shared interest. I might like music, and then four other people like music in different ways, maybe listening to it, maybe creating it, maybe different genres of music. It doesn't matter. They don't have to be identical. But we come together and we share that interest. And what we have is not just accountability, but there's that, again, that dopamine release, right? The endorphins that are also released because of the social interaction. And so if we were going to set some curiosity challenges for ourselves, and looking at the guidelines or the recommendations that I shared, like seeking novelty. That could novelty in any way, shape, or form, as in I'm going to go to a city in America that I've never been to before. I'm going to try a new food every month. Do that with a group of people in some way, shape, or form, family, friends, in any way. And so that way you're sharing these things together. It's that collective awe that's experienced that reminds us. It's like, again, I experienced awe when I experienced snow for the first time, in terms of like the magical quality of this powdery substance that I never imagined that I would ever experience. And having my family that was also Miami born or Cuban born, and in Minneapolis, and 15 years old, and having that shared together, it's twice as powerful and is twice as encouraging, and also helps keep that safety net for us. It helps us feel familiar and comforted as we share that with someone else. A lot of science into New Year's resolutions find that when two or more people share the same New Year's resolution, they're more likely to stick to their plan, right? They're less likely to give up on that resolution. And so that collective awe experience is really important. But we're also going to just have to challenge ourselves every day to try something new, whatever that thing is, and seek that question and ask that question versus sticking to the all too familiar conclusion.
So there's a question that's come through a couple of times, and that's the question about correlation between curiosity and ADHD.
Mm.
Is there one?
Yeah, ADHD can be curious about 10 things at once. That's, I I I I have ADHD, so I have not. I don't know that there's an actual correlation that I'm aware of in terms of, right, ADHD being a mediating variable that would either induce or prohibit a curiosity in some way, shape, or form. But that is interesting that speaking from my own personal experience, because it's not research that I've engaged in, but speaking in my own personal experience, it really does feel like I can be curious about multiple things at once. Or, there are different definitions of curiosity that I should say. Like I'm given a very simplified summary and presentation of it, but there's curiosity in terms of like curiosity traits that we might have that could shift from context to context. And then there's also definitions and explorations of curiosity that look more at our sustained engagement in an activity. So some of us might be familiar with like flow theory. Csikszentmihalyi, the scholar who coined the term flow theory, looks at this concept, this experience where we become so engrossed in an activity, so lost in the activity because we're just so into it. Our interest is activated. We're trying to close the gap between what we know and what we don't know. that we lose track of time, we lose our sense of self, we don't even remember where we are, and then we look up and all of a sudden 4 hours have passed, but it really only feels like 5 minutes. That is also a version of curiosity. And what I've noticed about myself with ADHD, something like book reading or video game playing, or I do a lot of hiking, and those moments when I lose time, though they're actually healthy brain refreshers for me, because for the most part in my day, I'm having so many radical thoughts at once, spiraling around, that when I can have those moments where I'm deeply curious in this book or the story or even this person that I'm having a conversation with, it feels good to be able to actually focus for once. And that's still a version of curiosity. Um, but yeah, so there's a wide, the field is very diverse in terms of how these things get defined, but I'm not specifically aware of correlations with ADHD.
So again, about curiosity, what do we know about one's ability to listen to others as a predictor of curiosity?
Yeah, that goes back to the openness. Yes.
Okay.
And the collective all. There's also I can see in my notes there's also some connections with empathy, and it sounds like that's what we were asking. And so I have a quote here from a study in 2023 that says, and it was looking at specifically curiosity and empathy in terms of the ability to listen to others. It's sequenced more as in cultivating and teaching curiosity can help people listen to others versus the other way around. And so the quote is. Empathy requires an abiding curiosity about what life may be like outside of our own experiences. And in this study, it references other studies that looked at healthcare settings. Physicians, therapists, social workers, surgeons, and other care-related professions who are trained in empathic curiosity, again, another dimension of curiosity, empathic curiosity, have improved relationships with patients that in some cases even result in improved patient recovery. So, in other words, patients who feel that their healthcare providers listen to them, a lot of them actually report improved physical recovery. Like there's actual bodily effects to this idea that, like, yeah, my healthcare provider listens to me. I feel listened to. Those healthcare providers in this study were trained in empathy, right? And trained in empathic curiosity. Empathic curiosity means that you can be trained to care so much about the person in front of you, regardless of disagreement for a variety of beliefs. You're so curious about them that by asking questions about them, you're eliciting empathy and you're listening to the feeling that you're being listened to. Again, Braver Angels has turned this into a really good methodology, and where some of the studies that I think informed that method I referenced, where you had people filled out on a survey their political beliefs. So researchers purposely paired people up with others who shared very different political beliefs, and they were only allowed to ask questions of each other for a certain amount of time. And those people reported that they were listened to, that they had a civil discourse, and that they enjoyed the presence of one another, even if they said, yeah, we still don't disagree with each other, but I actually enjoyed that experience, versus sitting down with someone and yelling at each other for 10 minutes, thinking that the louder I scream, the more chance I have at convincing the other person, right? And so empathic listening, yes, there are some correlations there in terms of how people can be trained, especially in healthcare professions.
Thank you. So one question, you began this with a definition of lifelong learning as curiosity. There are so many apps on phones now that promote lifelong learning, that promote brain function, cognitive development, all of those things. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, those are very interesting, because a lot of these apps and programs also showcase a lot of studies that say how wonderful they are at and on your brain, or the health impact on your brain. And I don't want to take anyone's joy away. If you love these games, keep playing them. But a lot of the results of these studies are specific to the app itself. They don't transfer, meaning you get better at the game. Good job. But we actually don't see that actually transferring to improve curiosity or brain health and so on. So I think it's one piece, as a maybe a humorous side story. Years ago, my grandmother passed away, and she had Alzheimer's, and so we had some testing done. As my mom gets older, she's showing signs of early onset dementia, and so there's my sister and I are very, very close, and my sister was sharing with me how concerned that it looks like this might run in the family. So one thing she said to me is that she's right-handed, and so she's like, I started brushing my teeth with my left hand to try to, you know, create some
Great
mental
then.
flexibility. Yeah. And so those, whatever, like, that's not going to harm you. That's not going to harm her. Playing these app games aren't going to harm as well, but no, it's not going to do the job entirely. Right. My sister and I, very close. We love each other to death, but we also don't politically agree. So I use it as an opportunity to say, maybe you can try my point of view then, politically speaking. And she's like, nope, nope, not ready for that. so, um, so, you know, we'll stretch as much as we're willing to stretch. But just know, like, that's one piece of the puzzle. And some of those, you know, some of those studies are meant to get you to sign up for the app, not necessarily to give you a healthy mind. But really, the answers are far simpler, right? It's just how willing are we to ask questions about the world, of one another, about ourselves? How willingly are we to seek that novelty, to engage difference, and to pursue relationships that haven't been part of our normal routine before? Those kind of things, like I say, they are simple, but you know, they can. I try to do those things as well, in terms of like, I need to hang out with new people, and then the weekend comes, like, I'm tired, I'm just gonna watch movies. And so I know, but having this as a, I think the collective engagement and new experiences with one another in social units like affinity groups, the research suggests are far more powerful than any quick fix.
Oh, thank you. And you know, JT, I just looked at the time and I was so engrossed with the conversation that I totally lost track of it. It is
That's
after
flow
8 o'clock.
theory. That's
We
flow theory. Yeah.
so it was wonderful. Thank you. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but I do understand that you just had a book contract awarded. So congratulations. And can you just
Thank
take
you.
a minute to share with us what that's about?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so the book is tentatively titled Teaching, Learning, Caring in Higher Education. And the general argument is that a lot of what we've been talking about, especially around empathic curiosity, that we focus a lot of higher education on the intellect, on neck up, knowing a bunch of things, memorizing those things, and then spitting those things back on some kind of test, to show how smart we are. What we've left out are the affective dimensions, right? We don't necessarily know how to care about one another when we graduate college. We don't know how to care about ourselves necessarily when we graduate college. I come from a family with some health issues, and I didn't learn how to actually eat right. I didn't learn about concepts of nutrition until I was in grad school and I met somebody who was a nutritionist, right? It's not part of a curriculum, to like care for ourselves, care for the world, care for one another. So the argument is that curiosity is this wonderful opportunity for us to learn meaningful ethics of care, critical care, not just for care related professions like nursing, and surgeons, and doctors and social workers, but for one another, and to sustain a healthy community. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. And thanks for joining us tonight. I appreciate it very
I
much.
appreciate it. Thank you so
You've
much for inviting me.
given us a lot to think about, and thank you all for tuning in. I do apologize if we did not get to your questions tonight. There were quite a few. They were fantastic. Um, if you'd like to share tonight's episode, webinar, or if you would like to watch it again, we'll post it on our website in just a few days. If you would like to see other lifelong learning opportunities, we invite you to visit our website, wlu.edu/lifelong. While you're there, we have a lot of offerings for you, travel at home and on campus. We hope to see you next week with Josh Fairfield, the Williams Donald Bain Family Professor of Law. He'll discuss the true risks of artificial intelligence, its ability to perform human tasks, and its growing indifference to human welfare. So we hope to see you next week and see you soon. Bye.